Oh boy. Are you ready for a doozy? Because I sure am. We're talking about The Legend of Zelda, Hyrule Historia. Deep breaths, deep breaths. What's up, everybody? It's me, Majora, and very excited to bring you an in-depth, honest, objective, transparent review, look at, and some criticisms of Hyrule Historia, published by Dark Horse Comics, written by Nintendo. I have a lot to say, and I'm very excited to do it. Many of you know me as sort of a Zelda guy. I don't know if I'm a Zelda guru, but I do like my Legend of Zelda games. Some of them are my most impactful games. And I've put off reading the Historia for a long time. I'll get into why in a bit. In the meantime, if you do like Zelda content, gaming, literature, reviews, and all of the sort, and me, if you like me, be sure to subscribe. We got lots of content. In the backlog, too. Lots of stuff worth checking out if you haven't already. Go check out some of my videos. After. Hyrule. Oh, boy. Okay. The book was published in 2011 in Japan. It got overseas releases in 2013 when it was translated and edited. I remember seeing it on store shelves like 2014 or so at Barnes & Noble. I always thought it was vastly overpriced, and I didn't fully understand what it was. I thought it was about the history of the Zelda games, and to me it's kind of like, well, I already know about the Zelda games that I care about, so I never really went out of my way to acquire the book, to read about it. Later, Nintendo gave it with their Wii U's as digital copies when they sold the Wind Waker edition of the Wii U. I didn't own a Wii U, so I couldn't read it that way. I was too broke. And years went by, and I thought, you know what? It's about time. It is about time. The Zelda series has a lot to do with time, which we'll get into. I asked for it for my birthday last year, and I've taken my time. I've read it. Here's what I've got to say. It's not that bad. This book is broken into 4 parts with an intro by Shigeru Miyamoto and an outro by Eiji Aonuma. Miyamoto goes into the origins of the series and sort of how he came up with it in his mind, and then uses that as a segue to Skyward Sword. The entire first part of the book, which is a good 60, 70 pages or so, is about Skyward Sword. And I get it, because Skyward Sword was the origin. It was also the game that came out in 2011, alongside, I believe Ocarina of Time 3D was coming out around that time as well. But they really wanted to push Skyward Sword and the new mechanics and everything. And so Miyamoto talks about the innovation and sort of the inspiration that went into Skyward Sword. I don't think it's a very good intro to the book, because based on title alone, you'd think you're just getting the history of Hyrule. I understand why he did it, and I don't dislike the section. I just have questions about framing. Could he have framed the book in a way where we knew that this was going to be sort of promo material for the game at the time? An in-depth look at Skyward Sword plus Hyrule Historia. I don't know what the title would have been. I'm just throwing ideas out there. Anyways, the first section of the book is on Skyward Sword. You get a lot of cool insight into the lore. Skyward Sword is technically the origin story of the time. You know, since this book came out, there have been other Zelda games. So the timeline has shifted a bit. There will need to be a revised version of the Historia, if there's not already. I actually don't know. But Skyward Sword got its own section, and it's pretty cool. There were things that either I had forgotten or just had never realized from playing the game. I didn't realize that Zelda was the reincarnation of a goddess. I didn't realize that Hyrule would be destined to cycles of Ganon's resurrection time and time again. These are things that I guess I understood vaguely, maybe, or not at all, but that section proved pretty useful for it. There's some really cool concept art. You see variations of characters, versions that weren't used, versions that were decided on. You have little editor notes about little features for every concept art. And I think that's super cool. You get a little insight into the creative process behind the making of the game. You get to know more about some of these really defined personalities. I think one thing Zelda has always succeeded on is making the characters personable. Their gestures, their gesticulations. I can't forget Groose, from my time playing Skyward Sword. He's always been kind of a meme, and I kind of like that. The art style is also more of, how would you say, the Romance era, if you think about European art and Renaissance era, I guess you might say. And it's very good looking for what it is. I know for a while there, Zelda was defining its identity, and it's been redefined throughout the ages. I like Skyward Sword's art for what it is. Underneath the pages at the bottom, there's sections that talk a little bit about insights into either characters or settings. And it's confusing for me because the intent of the section appears to be giving the reader insight into what was led to creating it. What happens sometimes, this is where this practice starts and I begin to really question it, is that the editors choose to frame it as questions. I have two here that really kind of just put question marks in my mind. Princess Zelda and the Goddess's Harp. The harp in Skyward Sword looks a lot like Sheik's harp in Ocarina of Time. Could it be the same one? Is our hero always oversleeping? The opening scenes of Zelda games often show Link sleeping. Is this a way of conveying the notion of a normal person waking up to the unknown and embarking on a hero's journey? I don't know what to make of these questions, because if you're the guy at Nintendo who made the Zelda games, and if you're co-authoring this book with other people from Nintendo, then wouldn't you know the answer? Why are you teasing me with the answer? Is the hero always waiting to embark on the hero's journey by awaking from sleep? I don't know. You wrote the game. You have authorial intent. I guess you could say it's my way of trying to create my own meaning. The artist doesn't want to tell you what to think. I get that. But it also makes me wonder, one, are they insulting my intelligence by giving me a one question answer that I should definitely say yes to, or I should definitely say no to? And then two is I wonder who is the real author here. If you look on the front page, it tells you that the editor for the Japan version is Eiji Aonuma, the producer and director of many entries in the Zelda series. In parentheses next to it is Nintendo. There's no author section, which I found weird. I guess it makes sense when you've got a book that relies heavily on concept art. However, I would have liked a bit more clarity here. One thing I'm just not getting so far is clarity. What is the purpose of this book? I think I read into it at the time too that this was a corporate move to try and sell more Zelda games, and maybe the book was the second thought in that process. Anyways, you could say that's a nitpick. I guess it is, because overall I do like the Skyward Sword section. I like reading into the lore of the game. without having to go back to the game itself. But as somebody who's played the game, I do have my question marks too about the style in which this is being portrayed and conveyed. Good things, bad things, it's a mix. Wait till the next section. Let's talk about timelines and the Zelda timeline. This is what you came here for, right? The Hyrule Historia section. This is about the chronology of the Zelda timelines, not in which the games were released, but in which the narratives make sense. So I think that when I have thought about the Zelda timeline in 2013, or ever for that matter, I've never needed it to make sense. I've very often just understood that these are isolated entries in the series, for the most part, with a couple exceptions. The timeline is split into 3 after Ocarina of Time from a sort of time travel perspective. I'm going to give you an overview of why it works and why it doesn't in the following clip.
Okay, I have thought about this thing for like 24 hours, and it almost, it was like this close to making sense to me. But they fucked it up. They fucked it up here, and I'll get back to that. But this could have made sense, right? So like Ocarina splits, and after opening the Temple of Time, Link becomes an adult, kicks Ganon's ass, and then disappears. That's the adult era. Great. When Link goes back in time, peace is restored, and he's able to continue on his days. He goes to Majora's Mask. This one's fine. These two are fine. This one, the way I was telling myself in my head is like, okay, this is the parallel dimension where Link leaves as a child and never goes to the future. So there is no adult Link. And then, like, it makes sense because then you have, like, the dark ages of A Link to the Past, and et cetera, et cetera. I don't care about, like, the resurrection shit. Okay, the problem is that when you look at their explanation for this, their explanation is that adult Link got his ass kicked. And I'm just like, you were this close to explaining this. Just a little bit more tweaking and this would have made sense. But nope, you fucked it up. So that sucks.
So, as you can tell, I have an issue with the fundamental flaw in the timeline, the game over timeline. You could make the argument that there is an era where the hero never stops the tragedy that occurs in Ocarina of Time's narrative. I understand that. I just think that the framing here is bizarre. And for me to suspend my disbelief for a game over arc that doesn't exist is questionable. It's hard to draw parallels to this because time travel is frequently not handled well in many mediums because there will always be a sort of plot hole. Well, what if? What if this? What if that? I still think that if you used the style of the parallel timeline where Link is never teleported to the future, or he teleports to a different future timeline, and then everything continues from there, that may have worked to the game's benefit. Another thing I'm thinking is like, Banjo-Kazooie, when you get a game over, if you've ever game overed in Banjo-Kazooie, I'm sure you have if you've gotten to Grunty, they have an alternate ending where Tootie, it gets all of her beauty extracted and imported into Grunty. Technically, that's a different timeline. That is something that exists. There is no real game over timeline in Ocarina of Time. You could even make the argument that Link gets teleported back to a different original timeline, and there is an original one where he doesn't get teleported back. It still raises questions about how would that work. I get it. It's confusing. It's messy, but that's time travel. All of the same, for the purpose of how they branch these timelines, the Apocalypse arc, where that one is flawed, is necessary. I would like to talk about the 3 timelines and how they are depicted in this section of the book. So I don't have the exact same names from memory, but I'll just tell you as I understand it. One is the Apocalypse timeline where adult Link dies. One is the child timeline where Link continues on his journey after being teleported back in time to the Chamber of Sages. The other is the peaceful timeline where adult Link goes back in time and disappears, so to speak, and there's no hero for that era. It's like 3 consecutive timelines. I'm going to give you kind of a summary of what you can expect as you're reading this. The style in which this is written is that you read about how the cycles of resurrection occur for Ganondorf, or Ganon, depends on how you name him. Depends on who he is in the game, actually. And you see how the story progresses from Skyward Sword. I think there's something in between, and then also to Ocarina of Time. And then how it splits from there. All Nintendo really needed to do here was basically tell you that in every instance, Ganondorf is resurrected, a new Link comes back to save the day, and the goddess reincarnate in Zelda helps him in that quest. And they all make up the 3 facets of the Triforce. The first timeline, the Apocalypse timeline, is contingent on Link failing the quest in Ocarina of Time. And then the world is in chaos. And then it proceeds to Link to the Past, where the world is kind of in a shitty situation, and it's the Dark World. And then from there, Twin Rova resurrects Ganon in Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, 1 per game. They send their lackeys. And then I think there's a final game. It's like Zelda 2 or The Adventure of Link or something. Honestly, I could see it. As much as I have a problem with the flaw of the framing for the Apocalypse arc, I could see the world being in a cataclysmic state after Ocarina of Time, leading to each of these games. You have like momentary glimpses where you think there's peace, but there's really not. You know, even when you get to Kakariko Village and Link to the Past, you know, the guards are running amok and secretly performing the duties of whoever the sage is there, or not the sage, the wizard. I can't remember. Too many details. I don't know. And then I like how in Oracle of Ages and Seasons, technically those games depend on you playing each one 3 times to really get the full experience. I don't know how many people have really done that. I've gotten through several of the gameplay styles for Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, but I have never fully completed both of those games simultaneously. Very cool system, though. It's not my favorite timeline, but I think it works for what it is. The next one is the original timeline arc, where Link gets sent back to his original timeline, warns Zelda about what Ganondorf will do, and then Zelda says, "All right, Link, you must go," gives him the Ocarina of Time, and he goes on his way. Finds his way in Termina in Majora's Mask, and completes his own kind of side quest there, saving the people there. And in the future, Ganondorf of that Ocarina of Time era is sent to be executed for the crimes that he will commit to Hyrule, because Zelda sees it. She sees that it could happen. And so in the process of that execution, he kills one of the sages, and then instead of actually being executed, is banished into the Twilight Realm. And thus the chaos ensues from Twilight Princess. And then finally they segue somehow into Four Swords Adventure. I don't fully understand that one. That one seems like a cop-out to me. Like, okay, well, let's just resurrect Ganondorf and say that this connects to Twilight Princess. That's another instance where I think it could be considered lazy writing. But if you do think about the Skyward Sword to Ocarina to Majora's Mask Twilight Princess pipeline, like, there is some logic there. I could honestly see it being really fun to just go through like all 4 simultaneously, and they make sense in that regard. Oh, I think I forgot Link's Awakening in the Apocalypse timeline. Honestly, that, you know what, I'll come back to that. I think that would have made sense in the next one. For what it is, though, I appreciate that you can get some insider experience by playing them sequentially in that order. I think that's pretty cool. The last one is the Adult Link timeline, where Adult Link is sent back to his original timeline, and then everything continues from there forward. So Ganondorf is sealed, he's dead, and Link has gone back. There's no hero for that future timeline anymore, but it just continues from there. And in that process of continuation, Ganondorf is eventually resurrected, but there's no hero. And so the people of Hyrule are freaking out. And thus in the Wind Waker, the king calls upon the goddesses to intervene, and they selectively tell the people of Hylia, I don't know how you say it. I've always said Hylia, but maybe that doesn't make sense. Hylia, to go to the highest parts of the mountain to escape the impending doom of the flood. It's kind of messed up if you think about it. I'm kind of getting like Titanic vibes, where like the aristocrats get to survive. So that's the people of Wind Waker, I guess, is the wealthiest. Look at that. Zelda, a narrative about capitalism. Oh, well. Or the aristocracy. But regardless, it's logical. It makes sense. And then from there, it goes into Phantom Hourglass. Logically, I think you get like the sailing connection, and then to Spirit Tracks, where Link and Tetra sail, form their own continent, and the Spirit Tracks arc exists on the DS. For what it is, I kind of like it. I think it's a different take, and I think it does make sense. A lot of this does feel like reverse engineering, and you know what? I think if they were smarter, they could have written the Link's Awakening segment where Link sails to Koholint Island into this somehow, maybe where he takes a break from like Phantom Hourglass or something, I don't know, or from Wind Waker, and he ends up like on this kind of mysterious quest. Nitpick, all that aside, I think you really have to suspend your disbelief in order to buy into some of these arcs, but I don't think all of it's not feasible. I think you just have to be willing to accept mistakes in the timeline, which is something that Aonuma says in the outro. Something about inconsistencies. You may notice some inconsistencies, and I'll get back to that after. The Historia section is really the meat and potatoes. It's why you came here. And for what it is, if you can go in with like a super open mind, like I'm telling you, like you cannot be, you can be critical, and you can say this doesn't make sense and it shouldn't exist. But if you do that, you won't get enjoyment from the timeline. And I just say it's not worth your time. You're just going to freak out over it. I'll give kind of a summation of how I feel about that at the end. But that's kind of my overview of that section. The third section is called Creative Footprints, and it goes into detail about concept art throughout the Zelda games, I guess. I want to say timeline, but it doesn't make sense here. Throughout the chronology of the Zelda games, from start to finish, like you get assets that were used. You get a lot of like first insights into artworks that like have never been released to the public previously, like a lot of like illustrations and maps of like, you know, the original Zelda games, like dungeon design and things like that, things in Link's Awakening. Actually some pretty cool stuff, if you, especially from a game design perspective, from a 2D game design perspective. They don't really go into the 3D game design. There is a big focus on the most modern Zelda games, especially Twilight Princess. I think the section as a whole is maybe like 90 pages, and of all of the Zelda games up to that time, I think there's like 10, 15 or so, 30 pages are dedicated to Twilight Princess. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think Twilight Princess has some of the most interesting art. And by the way, there's no Skyward Sword in this section because it's completely covered in the beginning of the book. And I think Twilight Princess is probably the second most interesting here in terms of like amount of assets. A lot of like very, I don't know. A lot of like good insights into what like the creators were thinking at the time. But at the same time, there's a question about, are the creators writing the portions of this book? And I understand that Zelda games are massive undertakings and that maybe Aonuma doesn't know every single thing that goes into like every single character of the game. But again, they keep going with the question strategy and it's driving me nuts. It's not all the time, but when they do it, I'm just like, what is the purpose here? So a couple examples. This is a big one for me actually in Twilight Princess. Ilia, she's a main character early in the game. And she... you know, she has significance towards the plot. Looking carefully at these concept sketches, you can see the mark that closely resembles Navi, the fairy that appeared in Ocarina of Time, on Ilia's brow. I'd be really curious to know what they were planning with that. Okay, I forgot to mention this in the Historia part, but technically Navi leaves Link during, like, somewhere in between Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. My memory is like, it's not great. I think it's like as he's going into the forest of Termina. And so like, I think there is a potential for Ilia and Navi to be somehow the reconnection. But the fact that Aonuma doesn't know, if we're assuming it's Aonuma writing, is questionable to me. Like, how doesn't he know that? How does it like... or why was it rejected? Like, I feel like there's, if we're going into the history of the games and the game's development, like we could really dig into like the reasons for it, not just end on speculation. I get it. You want the fan base teasing and picking and doing whatever at all these things and it'll leave them bantering about it for ages. But to me, it's just like, I think we deserve the answers. I don't think we should be like left in a gray area for them. I could be wrong. I mean, I have my own perspective on this. I'm open to disagreement on this. Okay, a few more. Some of these were just like in the vein of like, is this insulting my intelligence? This one threw me off the most. Dan Goro. So the Gorons are kind of enemies in Twilight Princess. And initially, you know, you get to like them or whatever. The helmet he wears is similar to that of a warrior. Is he a samurai Goron? I mean, like, what do you want me to say to that? Yes? No? Why does it matter? Why are you asking me this in a creative footprint note? You could just, like, tell me he was inspired by the Shogun era samurai. Like, you know, there's potential there. And so, like, to just leave it on that question, I just don't understand what was the point there.
Hey everybody, Future T here, Future Majora T, in the post-edit phase here to debunk my own example. This is the only one that doesn't apply to my argument about the questioning strategy being stupid. It still is. Anytime that you see printed text in the book, that's coming from the hindsight post-edit phase. So those questions still apply and still are confusing, versus this one is actually concept art. So actually just take this off of my argument. I don't like, that's a bad example, because I guess this is a different argument about whether or not that question is a good question for the creators of the time. It's not for the reader. It's not for you to really think about. It was for the game developers in 2005 or whatever. So Yeah, there's that.
Anyways, I liked some of the concept art. There was some unused concept art that was demonstrated. There was like a GameCube island and a stovepipe island in Wind Waker that I thought were pretty cool. The male version of Impa, he's called Impas, like Grandpa Impa. I don't like that was really cool. So there are some really nice assets that I think you can peruse in this section. The final section is a creative spin on Skyward Sword in manga form by Akira Himikawa, or it's Akira. I'm not sure the pronunciation of the author. In any case, that's a pseudonym. It's two female authors. I have a couple of their books up here, actually. Do not feel like grabbing them. And I enjoy them for what they are, but I feel like they are a bit cartoonish in a sense. Akira Himikawa was tasked with creating manga for the Zelda games in, I think it was 1999. And 2011 was the first time that they were asked to come back and create their own kind of spin on it for Skyward Sword. This is rooted in some of the elements of Skyward Sword. Like I see some things that are similarities, maybe some creatures or items and things. And I mean, that's cool. And so, like, I guess I appreciate that it's not entirely tied down to the narrative that is Skyward Sword. It's not just a retelling of it. At the same time, some of the creative liberties, I wonder. Like, I wonder how well does this portray Link? I guess technically the fact we're giving him a voice and we give him dialogue, maybe that's what people want. Like, that's fine. And honestly, he does come off as kind of like a knight and a warrior, but you may find that disagreeable if you've always kind of enjoyed him as a silent protagonist. The other is like the artistic portrayal of Link. Again, an artist is free to portray a character however they want. It's just that I get the sense that, I don't know if this is a manga style or whatever, but like his features come across as very androgynous, maybe. Not androgynous, but he's like, it's kind of just like, I feel like it's gender confused. And while I don't know if I have a problem with that. I guess if his gender was always confused, I wouldn't care. But I guess the fact that he's a guy does bother me. Maybe listen, I don't want to go too much into gender stuff, but I guess you could even say that in Skyward Sword he was portrayed that way. I don't know. I guess I wasn't as bothered by the portrayal in the video game as I am in the manga. I don't even know why it bothers me. Maybe it shouldn't bother me, but maybe I'm not a target demographic of manga because of how kind of bubbly and cartoonish characters come across. I always thought Link should be kind of like a badass or like heroic and like kind of stern. Not to say like he needs to be grizzly and have a beard or anything, although that would be pretty cool, bearded Link. But I don't know. Like I just thought he should be rough. I don't get the sense that he is in the comic book. Hey, I just want to make an addendum here. Adult Link in the comic strip is more masculine than I gave him credit for. Young Link still looks pretty weak, but I gotta say, to Akira Himikawa, credit is due where credit is due. Again, though, it's me. You have your own interpretation, by all means. The epilogue. So I want to read you a segment here. I'm going to have to put the mic down to read it, but I'll try and read into the mic. Okay, this is Wrapping Things Up by Eiji Aonuma. The history of Hyrule allows players to determine where each Zelda game is positioned in the chronology of the series. One thing to bear in mind, however, is that the question the developers of the Legend of Zelda series asked themselves before starting on a game was, what kind of gameplay should we focus on, rather than what kind of story should we write? Examples are like in Skyward Sword when we're talking about Wii Mode Plus, or like using the touchscreen on the DS. Anyways, because the games were developed in such a manner, it could be said that Zelda's storylines were afterthoughts. As a result, I feel that even the story of The Legend Begins in Skyward Sword was something that simply came about by chance. Flipping through the pages of the history of Hyrule, you may even find a few inconsistencies. Thus, it is my hope that fans will be broad-minded enough to take into consideration that this is simply how Zelda is made. Deep breaths. Okay. So, I am a fan of the games. I am a fan of the series. I like elements of this book. I think that some of it is questionable. I really question why you would make a book called Historia after confessing that the storylines were afterthoughts. But you frame it in a way where it absolves you of that guilt as well. Well, it could be said. No, just say it. If they were afterthoughts, they were afterthoughts. Or if they're not, then reject that. If they had elements of, okay, we did want to tie Link's Awakening to the sailing arc in Phantom Hourglass, which is not what they did, by the way, then, you could say that like they had elements of that. But that framing leaves open interpretation that you just were lazy in how you approach this. I am already like, it's very easy for me to be livid about the game over arc in the timeline. That makes no sense. It makes no sense. It's just, like I said, I think it's bizarre. I think it's a bastardization of the narrative as a whole of Zelda as a series. And I think that it just lends into the idea that this book was only meant to capitalize on the assets of Zelda. And, I think another thing, there's another line in there that really kind of screws me up. And I think it says like, oh, maybe it's not in this. Maybe it was in something I read online about how this book is great for people, even who are just not even that much fans of Zelda. Actually, I think that's really who this is meant for. I don't think this is meant for the big Zelda fans. I think this is really a commercial product. But the fact that you don't debunk some of this stuff and that maybe some of the framing wasn't as well conceived as it should have been, and that some of the notes are written in a style where it makes me question even your understanding of the creative decisions that went into your series, it's just mind-boggling, really. I understand, like, even I forgot some elements, like names and stuff, but I don't work for Nintendo. I didn't create Zelda. I just play the games. I feel like when it comes to Nintendo, they have always depended on their seal of approval, the quality seal of approval. That used to be stamped on their N64 games and maybe their NES cartridges. That's not my era. Brian, you can jump in there. When it comes to this book, I don't think it passed the quality seal of approval. Maybe it passed Nintendo's seal of approval, but it didn't pass my seal of approval. Does that matter? Apparently not, because this book is a bestseller, and also the reception is stupidly high. I was almost baffled in just a brief glimpse online to see an average rating among thousands of ratings of 4.9 out of 5 stars. And then also to read through the reception on the Wikipedia page and see just the most softball criticisms. Like stuff like, I think it's odd to put the history together, but fun nonetheless. That's the harshest criticism on there. I'm shocked. It's almost like I'm not conspiratorial in the slightest. I'm not like gonna say like they were bought out or anything. I don't think that's the case. But I do think that people are a bit lenient on this book, from what I've seen. And that kind of bothers me. It kind of bothers me that we're going to allow a threshold of subpar quality for a series that has always kind of depended on its quality. And I think people hold the games to high quality, so why not hold the materials as well? I think that like a little bit more time in the writing room, like would you allow this to fly for a JRPG? I'm just wondering, like from a narrative standpoint, would you allow such a drastic inconsistency as the existence of a timeline for something that never happened within the video games to exist? Would you allow your creators to speak about the game in a way that also says like, oh, well, maybe our story might have been an afterthought, but you'll never know? What? Like, I get it too. I get that these games have technically come out with the hardware and they've been from a gameplay perspective first. But if that's the thing that you depended on, then maybe that's the way that the book should have been framed, is as the history of the evolution of Zelda games. Now, maybe I'm not going to tell you what can or can't exist. I just think it's dumb. I just think it's dumb to like frame a book about the story of Zelda and then at the very end say that it might have been an afterthought. I know I keep going back to that, but I think it's ridiculous. It's hard. It's really hard because, I mean, at the same time, I appreciate elements of this book. I actually appreciate some aspects of the timeline. I don't hate it. I don't hate it as much as like maybe people who will say like that because like that one aspect is so stupid and how it's kind of like you're shoehorning in, you know, video games from the series to make the timeline work. I don't necessarily disagree with that. I don't necessarily hate that. I actually think they make it work in some respects. I don't think like you can actually make art out of a puzzle with pieces that don't logically fit together. You know, it's pretty abstract. And I think that is something cool about the Zelda games. It's just that the process of the abstraction of the Zelda games in Hyrule Historia raises questions not in a critical manner, but in a fallacious manner. I don't know if you want me to break that down. I might just leave you on that. That's kind of my final thought on Hyrule Historia. I'm glad I read it though. I mean, it's cool. It's cool for what it is. Whew. What are we at? 39 minutes on Hyrule Historia. Holy smokes. That's my review. What stood out to you? Do you agree or disagree with any of my points? Let me know in the comments below. And also, have you read it? What did you think? Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you soon. Maybe bring you another gaming literature video in the near future. Toodaloos.